My name is Charlene Margot. I am the co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture, and we are delighted to have with us tonight Dr. Dave Feldman. Take it away, Dave.
Well, thank you, Charlene, for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. I guess the first thing that I should do is to share with you my slides, and then we will get going. So hopefully this will work. There we go. And hopefully you can all see the slides.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave.
Well, thank you again for having me so much to talk about a topic that has occupied really the last 20 years of my life. And that is sort of the twin topics of hope and resilience. This is what I, as a professor, teach about, what I do research on, and of course, what I work with clinically in the people that I serve. And what I'd like to do tonight is to talk a little bit about how to nurture hope and resilience. In our kids, yes, because probably most of you are here because you have kids, or perhaps you're professionals and you serve kids in some way. So how do we nurture hope and resilience in youth? But then secondly, I also want to talk about how to nurture hope and resilience in ourselves, because we as adults deserve that also, and particularly in the context of uncertain times. I don't think it's news to anybody that we live in some chaotic and uncertain times right now, and I really want to couch everything that I say in that context. So I also don't think it's news to anyone that we are in the midst of a youth mental health crisis. Mark talked about it just a moment ago. I'm sure you all know some of the stats, so I'm not going to belabor this, but I just want to present to you a couple of national statistics. First of all, this is the percentage of children in the US who have significant, not mild, anxiety or depression. And this is by the US Department of Health and Human Services. And this is comparing 2016 with 2020. So I want to point out that this is before the worst of the pandemic. And you can see that it breaks it out by race and ethnicity. But if you want the summary, it's over here to the left. These are the national averages. And what you can see is between 2016 and 2020, it went up 25%. Now, by the way, that statistic might even be low. There are studies that show that it went up by as high as 30%, depending on how you kind of measure anxiety and depression. But still, this should really give us pause. Here are the percentage of high school students who have seriously considered suicide. This really, I think, gives me a lot of pause and a lot of fear about what's going on in the world and in our country right now. You can see it breaks out again by all different groups, but again, the national average is right here. 22% of high school students say that they are seriously, not mildly, not thinking about it a little bit, but seriously considering suicide. And if you go all the way down to the bottom of the graphic here, you see this purple bar, 45% of youth who identify as LGBTQ plus are seriously considering suicide. So think about that. What that means is between 1 in 4 and 1 in 2 of our high school students are thinking about ending their lives. That is just an incredibly daunting statistic. So our youth are feeling anxious. They're feeling depressed. They're feeling amazingly stressed out. And in the worst cases, they're contemplating ending their own life. And honestly, as terrible as it is to say, who could blame them, right? Let's just look at our society for a moment. We've all lived through the last 4 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's still here, although thank heavens it's waned a little bit. We've all lived through loss and fear. We've all lived through isolation and loneliness. Many of our kids spent some of their most formative years, instead of being in school with their friends, behind a screen on Zoom, trying to learn in school, trying to socialize, which I think compounds some effects already of sort of too much or not the right kind of screen time for youth. So COVID-19 has been a huge influence. Then, of course, we have natural disasters. We have hurricanes. We have storms all over the world. We have fires that we've seen here on the West Coast, in Oregon, also in Canada, and of course, in Hawaii, that has taken tragically life and property. And a lot of our youth are incredibly afraid, as Mark commented earlier, about climate change and whether they will even inherit a world when they get older. We also, of course, have war and violence around the globe, but most particularly in Ukraine, that has taken so many lives tragically. And of course, we've seen and continue to see the ongoing reality of racial injustice and racial violence. And I say ongoing because it's lasted for far more than these 4 years, right? It goes back centuries. And of course, we still see it very much today and is an incredibly painful reality. So look, with all of these problems in our world, not to mention the context in which they all take place, which is incredible political bifurcation and anger, no wonder our youth, let alone us, are feeling depressed or feeling anxious. And I think underlying a lot of this depression and anxiety, and indeed, sometimes the desire to end one's life, is a real sense of hopelessness, a real sense of hopelessness. You know, I've spent the last 20 years of my life really trying to study hope, write about hope, talk about hope, and of course, work with hope in a psychotherapeutic context with people. And so people know me as the hope guy. And so people for years have come up to me and made comments of one type or another about hope. But I have to be honest with you, over the last 2 or 3 years alone, not even the last 4 years, the last 2 or 3 years alone, I've had more people than at any other time combined of my career and my life come up to me and say, Dave, I feel hopeless. I feel utterly hopeless that that the world will improve, that our society will improve, or even that I can improve my life. That's quite a thing for me to hear. And that makes me scared, because I think it's actually a scarily short step between I feel hopeless that things will ever get any better and saying, why go on, and contemplating suicide. So that really frightens me sometimes. Now, by the way, this isn't just my impression. The statistics bear this out. So here are statistics from the CDC. And these are, again, high school students. Over the last 10 years, this is their amount of hopelessness. This is the number of high school students that say that they feel utterly hopeless. And you've probably heard these statistics before. The big headline is this one: 50% of high school girls say that they feel utterly hopeless. By the way, high school guys are not too far behind. 29% say that they feel utterly hopeless. And unfortunately, this data doesn't include, gender non-binary or gender expansive youth. But think about that. What that means is between a third and more than a half of our youth are saying they feel utterly hopeless. So to me, what that means is not only do we have a mental health crisis on our hands, but I think we could also describe it as a crisis of hopelessness, a crisis of hopelessness. And I don't think this is only our youth. I think that this is us. I think that this is adults as well. So what I'd like to do with you this evening is talk a little bit about what hope is, first of all, why it's important, and then how do we nurture it? Of course, in our youth, but also in ourselves, because I think we're important models of hope for our youth. And if you'll permit me, I'd like to start at the very, very beginning, because hope is an ancient concept. It goes back millennia. And by the way, it's all over the globe in virtually every culture that's ever existed, East and West. So here's just one example. This is an ancient Greek plate, like an art plate, like you would hang on your wall. And it depicts the myth of Pandora. Perhaps you've heard of this myth. Sometimes it's called the myth of Pandora's box. And it actually bears striking resemblances to our own story of Genesis in the Old Testament. And here you see the gods creating Pandora. Pandora, according to this myth, was the first woman. And the gods created her to be the perfect human being. They gave her so many gifts. They gave her intelligence and wit and charm and humor. and they sent her to Earth. And just before they sent her to Earth, they gave her one more gift. They gave her the famous Pandora's box. And I just imagine that this box was beautiful, and maybe it was made of gold and had jewels on it. And of course, they gave her the famous warning: no matter what you do, never open the box. Now, I don't know what you would do, but the first thing that I would do is open the box. And that is exactly what she did. Being a regular red-blooded human being, she let curiosity get the better of her, and she opens the box. And according to the myth, out of the box fly all of the problems and evils that now afflict us as human beings. Out of the box flew war and pestilence and plague and poverty and disease and racism and prejudice and hatred and all of the things that we now have to deal with as humans. And of course, horrified, she slams the lid shut on the box. So according to the ancient Greeks, this is how evil got into the world. And most people think that this is where the story stops, but it doesn't. It keeps going on, and it has a lot to do with hope. Because as Pandora holds the box, she realizes there's something left inside. So she opens it up again just a little bit and looks inside, and way deep in the corner of the box, one thing remains, and that thing is hope. That thing is hope. Of course it is. Why would I be telling you the story otherwise? So to the ancient Greeks, though, hope is a very powerful thing. It is that very powerful psychological and even spiritual asset that allows us to survive and even thrive in a world that can be filled with evils and traumas and tragedies and problems. Unfortunately, I think in the last 2 millennia, we've lost that sense that hope is powerful. And I think that 2 misunderstandings or misconceptions of hope have come to predominate in our world, in our culture, in our society. And by the way, I've checked out these misunderstandings with colleagues of mine all over the globe across multiple cultures. And they tell me that some balance of these 2 misunderstandings exist in all of their different countries and languages as well. And here's what they are. The first misunderstanding. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I don't think hope is, and then I'll talk about what it is. And the first thing that I don't think hope is a warm, squishy feeling we cling to when we don't know what else to do. Sometimes I call this the consolation prize definition of hope. I don't know if you know what a consolation prize is. A consolation prize is a prize that you get when you really have failed or when you really have lost. And it's designed to just give you a little comfort. So, for instance, let's say you go on a television game show, like, for instance, The Price is Right is a really popular television game show. And you go and you compete on this game show, and you play all of the price guessing games, and you lose all of them. Let's just say you're the biggest loser in all of the history of The Price is Right. And just to make you feel a little better, to give you a little comfort, the host of the show sends you home with a year's subscription to Time magazine. Well, I don't have anything against Time magazine. It's a great magazine. But I didn't want Time magazine, right? I wanted to win the $1 million, or I wanted to win the new car. But that's essentially what a consolation prize is. It's a prize you get that gives you a little comfort when things really aren't going your way, when you really have failed or lost. And I think that that's how a lot of people think about hope. It's not powerful. It's not going to change the world. It's not going to change your life. It's just this comforting feeling that you get to have when things really aren't going your way. And by the way, this shows up all across our society. Here's a comic strip, for instance, that illustrates this misunderstanding. I love Hagar the Horrible. I don't know if you ever read it. Here we have 2 Vikings, and they're hanging in a dungeon. Undoubtedly, they're going to be put to death. And one of them says to the other, "We're completely helpless, with no chance of escape. What in the world keeps us going?" And the other one says, "Hope." So in this comic strip, hope isn't powerful. It's not going to break the chains. It's not going to set them free. It's not going to save their life or solve their problems, but it is going to give them some comfort. And don't get me wrong, I do love comfort. And I think hope is very comforting. But I'm going to go with the ancient Greeks, and I'm going to say that hope is more powerful than merely comfort. And I'll get into what I think hope is in a few minutes. But first, let me address the second misconception that I think you might notice everywhere. I've certainly noticed this in my life. Maybe you notice it in your life, in the people you know as well. And this is the idea that hope is the same as optimism, that hope equals optimism. Well, don't get me wrong. Hope and optimism are very similar in many ways. They're sort of sister concepts, but I don't think that they are the same thing. And to try to explore a little bit about how they're different, let's just talk about optimists for a second. In the English language, at least, and I imagine in many other languages, there are many sayings and metaphors about optimistic people. For instance, we sometimes say that optimists see the world through rose-colored glasses, right? They see the world through rose-colored glasses. So what does that mean? It means that there's a way in which they see the world as better than it actually is. There's an illusory element to this. They see the world as better than it really is. Or we say that optimists see the glass as half full, or even they see the glass as half full with cherry soda in it. So again, there's this way in which, in order to be optimistic, you kind of have to see things as better than they really are. You kind of have to paint a smiley face over the problems and obstacles in life and sort of tell yourself that everything is great and everything is going to be fine. And in fact, that is the definition of optimism. Psychologists generally define optimism as the belief that the world is a good place and that everything is going to work out fine and that the future is going to be great. That's kind of the definition of optimism. So it's good old-fashioned positive thinking. And look, if you are naturally an optimist, if you're naturally a positive thinker, that's awesome. That's great. No problem. That's really great. But a lot of people say they're not naturally optimistic. They're not naturally positive thinkers. And people particularly say that when they're facing traumas, or when they're facing serious illness, or when they're facing loss. I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone say, I just went through a trauma. I can't think positively right now. I can't be optimistic right now. So the good news is that you don't have to be an optimist to be hopeful. It's possible to be hopeful without being an optimist. And to illustrate that, I want to tell you a story about someone I met a number of years ago. This gentleman here is named Alan Locke. And Alan is somebody that myself and my co-author, Lee Daniel Kravitz, interviewed for our book, Super Survivors, which is a book about people who have encountered serious life-threatening traumas and have found a way, in some way, to be resilient in their lives. And this story starts when Alan is like 6 or 7 years old. He was a little kid, little British kid living in the UK, and he had a dream. His dream was always to be a sailor in the British Royal Navy. And so he tried really hard in school and got good grades. And eventually he achieved his dream when he was around 25 years old. And he was serving as a sailor aboard a ship in the Atlantic Ocean. And late one night, it must have been 1 a.m, he was trying to read some maps, some navigational charts, and his eyes were super blurry. So he kind of rubbed his eyes and he thought, well, it's late at night, I'll go to sleep, and in the morning, my eyes will be better. But unfortunately, in the morning, his eyes were not better. In fact, they were worse, they were blurrier. So eventually, he got to go to the doctor, and after a thorough exam, the doctor diagnosed him with something that no 25-year-old should have to be diagnosed with. He was told that he had macular degeneration, which is a disease of the eye that generally strikes when people are 60 or 70 or 80 years old. But he was only 25. And he was told by the doctor that most likely he would lose his vision, that he would go almost completely blind, and that there really was no cure. And of course, he flew into a deep depression. Who could blame him? And his friends tried to cheer him up. They tried to be optimistic. They tried to say, hey, look on the bright side, think positively, be optimistic, put your mind on the positive. Maybe it'll work out okay. And so he tried to be optimistic. He tried to tell himself, maybe I won't lose my vision. Maybe the doctor was wrong. Maybe my macular degeneration will reverse itself. He tried to tell himself, maybe I won't lose my job and my dream of being a sailor in the Navy. But unfortunately, reality happened, and he did lose his vision, and he did lose his job and his dream. And he told us that the more he tried to think positively and think optimistically, the more depressed he got. In fact, he said that the more he tried to think positively and optimistically, the more it just felt like he was lying to himself, that he was in denial, and he was also lying to the people that he loved. And what he said to us was that it wasn't until he gave up on optimism that he stopped trying to be optimistic. Only then was he able to move forward in his life. He told us that he needed to admit to himself that he had lost his vision and it was not coming back. Doctor after doctor after doctor had told him that. He needed to admit to himself that he had lost his job of being in the British Royal Navy and his dream, and it wasn't coming back. Advisor after advisor had told him that. And he said it was only once he was able to admit the reality that he was able to grieve, that he was able to grieve. And he had a lot of grieving to do. But he said it was through this kind of realistic thinking, leaving optimism behind and embracing realistic thinking, that he was able to eventually grieve and then go on to ask himself an incredibly hopeful and forward-looking question. And that question is, what now? What now? What can I do now to build the best life I can on top of realistically what I'm facing in my life? And he said it was that question that enabled him, that opened him up to setting new goals, to putting one foot in front of the other and moving towards a better future for himself. Now, if you fast forward to the present, he is now a world record holder. He holds the world record for being the first legally blind person to row a rowboat across the Atlantic Ocean. And he has become an inspiration to millions of visually impaired people across the globe. He also holds a record for being the first visually impaired person to trek across Antarctica. Again, holding a record and becoming an inspiration to millions more. And he says he did all this not through optimism, but through realistic thinking. Now, look, there's no doubt that Alan is a realistic thinker, but I think you'll agree that his story also has a lot of hope in it, right? That question, that very hopeful and forward-looking question, what now? What can I do now to build the best life I can on top of what I realistically face? That's a super hopeful thing to ask. So I think his story really illustrates the idea that real hope is grounded in reality. Real hope doesn't involve distorting or denying reality or painting a smiley face over the problems or obstacles that we face. Real hope starts by grounding ourselves in reality and then building on that reality and asking, what now? What now? And I just think that that is an important lesson for all of us about hope. Now, Alan is not the first person to suggest that real hope is grounded hope or is grounded in reality. I'm not the first person to suggest it either. In fact, it probably goes back hundreds of years. But one of the first psychologists to recognize this was this person in the corner here. This is C.R. Snyder. His friends called him Rick Snyder. He's one of the founders of the field of positive psychology, an luminary therapist, and also a good friend of mine. He actually passed away about 20 years ago. And he dedicated his whole life to trying to understand what hope is and how to nurture hope in people who need it. And at first, he wanted to figure out what's the definition of hope. So he started by going to lots and lots and lots of people and asking them simply, what does hope mean to you? But he quickly started to see that everyone was going to give him a different answer. Everyone had their own definition of hope, because hope is this beautiful, multifaceted concept. So he started to realize that if he wanted to come up with a single unified definition of hope, it was kind of a dead end to just ask people what hope means to them, because he was going to get a million different answers. So instead, he took a whole year and he did a very grassroots, community-based research study. He went to leaders of the community. These were business leaders, political leaders, religious leaders, educational leaders. And he approached all of these leaders and he asked them to name all of the most hopeful people they knew. Just give him a list of names of all of the most hopeful people they knew. And very importantly, he didn't give them a definition of hope, and he didn't ask what their definition of hope was, because he knew that was a dead end. He simply said to these leaders, using whatever definition you want, just give me the names of all of the most hopeful people you know. And then he took that list of hopeful people, and during the next year, he approached every single person on that list, and he interviewed them. And he asked them simply, tell me how you think. Tell me how you think. And what he discovered was that all of these hopeful people shared three things in common: goals, pathways, and agency. Now, Rick called these the three components of hope, but I actually think it's helpful to think of them as the three conditions under which hope thrives, because we now know that people who have these three conditions set in their lives not only feel hopeful, but they also have all kinds of other positive outcomes in their lives that I'll talk about a little bit later. So I want to tell you about each of these three conditions, but just because we're pressed for time, I thought that rather than share with you technical, dry definitions, that I would draw you a picture. But I do want to give you the warning before I do this, that this view of hope is not rocket science, as they say. It's not that complicated. It's pretty simple. In fact, you've probably thought about it before. You've probably thought of it before. And actually, I think that's one of its strengths. I think that one of the things that makes it powerful is that it is simple and it's practical. But I have to tell you, as a psychologist, someone who's worked with lots and lots of people over the years, I have to say, isn't it the things in our life that are simple, that we know we should do, that we often don't do? So I offer this view of hope, of these three conditions for hope to thrive, to you in that spirit. So at the beginning of our story, at the start of our drawing here, there's this little person. Let's pretend for a second that this is you, and you're feeling hopeless. You're not feeling very hopeful right now. And that's because you're missing the three conditions for hope to thrive. And the first one is this: having a goal or goals. So this is kind of obvious, but in order to have hope, you have to have something to hope for, a goal. Goals can be anything in our lives. They can be formal things, like to make more money or to get a raise or to buy a car. But they can also be informal, but still very important things, like to learn to love more fully, to be closer to the divine or deeper in our spirituality, to be a better parent or a better spouse or a better partner. But it's important to have goals for hope to thrive. Now, my bet is that most of you have lots and lots of goals in your life, some of them small and some of them large. But if you're anything like me, I'm going to bet that most of your goals that you work on a daily basis are things that you have to do. You have to do them for other people. You have to do them to make money. You have to do them for your boss. You have to do them for your partner. You have to do them for your kids. And don't get me wrong, it's great to have goals that you have to do. It's great to have responsibilities and to meet our responsibilities. That's what moves our life forward. But What's important for setting this first condition for hope to thrive is having at least one goal, even a small one, that's truly, personally, intrinsically meaningful to you. It's not something you have to do, it's something that you truly want to do. So I guess I challenge you today that if you look at your life and you don't have one of those intrinsically meaningful goals, I challenge you before this hour is through to see if you can find one of these intrinsically, personally meaningful goals. Even a tiny one can make all the difference in setting this first condition for hope to thrive. And I'll talk a little bit more about how to do that later. So that's the first condition. The second condition is called pathways. And this is simply my way of drawing a plan, a strategy, some way of getting from where you are to accomplishing your goal. And this is pretty intuitive. If you've ever been in a position in your life where you've had a goal that was important to you, but you couldn't think of a way to get there, or even worse, you believed there was no way you could ever get there, chances are you felt pretty hopeless at that moment. So this just illustrates why pathways are so important in hope. And then finally, the third condition for hope to thrive is called agency, or personal agency. And the word agency is kind of a strange psychology word, but basically what I'm trying to illustrate here is the motivation or the energy to get off your butt and do it, to go after your goals, because it takes motivation and energy to pursue goals. And again, if you've ever been in a position where you've had a goal that was important to you, but for whatever reason, you just couldn't find the energy and the motivation to do it, you probably felt pretty hopeless at that moment. Now, agency can come from lots of different sources. For some of us, our agency comes from our physical bodies, right? Eating a healthy diet, getting a good amount of sleep, exercising regularly can all be important sources of agency for some people. Agency for some of us, not all of us, can also come from our spirituality or our religion, right? Not everyone is spiritual or religious, and that's fine. But for people who are, agency often comes from prayer or meditation, or hearing an inspiring sermon, or being in a beautiful cathedral, or even hearing a beautiful, inspiring piece of music. Agency for almost all of us can also come from the other people in our lives, our family, our friends, those people who are cheerleaders for us in our life, those people who believe in us sometimes more than we do. Those can be important sources of motivation and agency for us. So these are the three conditions for hope to thrive: goals, pathways, and agency. And we know that when people have these three conditions set, they not only feel more hopeful, but they have all kinds of other positive outcomes in their life, which I promise I'll get to in a minute. But I do want to say that this drawing is, of course, way too simple. It's way too simple. Life is not this easy, right? Let's admit it. It's not as if in life we have our nice goal, we have our pathway, we have our agency, and then woo, we get there and it's all very easy and our goals just happen for us at the first try. That's not the way it works for most of us most of the time. Real life looks a little more like this, a little more like this. Here we are, here's our goal, we have our pathway, we have our agency, our motivation, and then boom, life throws us a curveball, right? Something blocks our way, an obstacle gets in our way. Maybe that's another person who's blocking you. Maybe it's an unfair and unjust system. Maybe it's bad luck. It can be any of a number of things, but very often people find themselves blocked. And the natural human tendency when something gets in our way like this is to play what I call the blame game. I don't know if you know what the blame game is, but in short, the blame game is blaming ourselves, blaming ourselves. Many people, when they're blocked, when their goals are blocked, blame themselves. What's wrong with me? I'm no good. I'm stupid. I'm incapable. I'm never going to achieve my dreams, right? And people get really stuck and feel hopeless. But what we know from 30 years of research is that people who are high in hope, that is, people who habitually have these three conditions for hope to thrive set in their lives, don't get stuck in the blame game. Instead, they do this. And you're going to have to watch the animation here. They do this. They ask themselves the incredibly hopeful and forward-thinking question, what now? What now? What can I do now to try to get around this block and build the best life I can on top of realistically what's getting in my way? How do I find an alternative way there? This is essentially the exact same thing that Alan Locke asked himself, right? What now? So this is a little closer to the reality. It's probably still an oversimplification, but it's a little closer to reality. And we know that people who habitually have these three conditions for hope to thrive set in their lives tend to, as I said, feel more hopeful, but also have lots of other positive outcomes. And so now is the time in the presentation where I'm going to try to tell you about 30 years of research in 3 minutes. We'll see if I can do it. I promise I'm not going to get into the boring details. I just kind of want to give you the conclusions. So what we know is that people who are high in hope, that is, people who have these conditions set in their lives, tend to accomplish their goals more often. And we know this because we have longitudinal studies where we follow people for months or sometimes years, and we know that people who have high hope at the beginning of the study are more likely to accomplish some of their goals by the end. We know that students who habitually have these conditions for hope to thrive set in their lives, in other words, high hope students, get better grades and drop out of school less in the case of college students. And by the way, that connection between hope and better grades is true in college students, it's true in high school students, and it's even true in grade school students. We know that hope is related to depression, inversely related to depression. That is, people who don't have these three conditions set in their lives in a habitual way tend to feel depressed. And we also know that when we're able to offer those people interventions that help set those three conditions for hope to thrive even a little, that it helps to lower their level of depression. And I think that's so important given the epidemic of depression that we're seeing in youth these days. We know that people who are higher in hope report that they feel that their life has a greater sense of purpose and meaning. There's also a connection between higher hope and better physical health. People with higher hope tend to have lower blood pressure, lower cholesterol, lower body mass index, lower blood sugar. And I think that makes sense, right? Because doing things like dieting and exercising, which are really hard, take pathways, agency, and goals, right? So it makes sense that there would be a connection. And finally, and very importantly, we know that people who are higher in hope, people who habitually have these three conditions for hope to thrive, when they encounter traumas and tragedies and losses in their life, they tend to be more resilient. We know that again because we've done longitudinal studies where we follow people for months, and a certain number of them, of course, will encounter a trauma or a loss. And we know that people who previously have had those conditions for hope set in their lives tend to practice greater resilience. And also, even through their pain, and pain is inevitable when you've encountered trauma or tragedy, but even through their pain, they say that they tend to grow in some way. So, and I think that's particularly important given the last 3 or 4 years of traumas and tragedies that we've all lived through. So lots of reason to think that hope is related to things we care about. So that leads me to the most profound and important slide of this evening. I hope you're ready for profundity. Hope is good. Hope is good. It's something that we want to have for ourselves. It's something we want our kids to have. If we're professionals, it's something we want the youth that we serve to have. So I want to spend maybe the last 10 minutes that I have really getting into what can I do? What can we do to help set the conditions for hope to thrive in our kids, but also in ourselves. And I want to say in advance of this that this is not easy to do. Even though this view of hope that I've given you, Goals, Pathways, and Agency, is very simple, it sounds simple, it's not easy to do. It takes real time and practice to set these three conditions for hope to thrive in your life. Unfortunately, real time is not what we have right now. We only have about 10 minutes. So what I'm going to try to do is give you 3 or 4 things that you can do to just begin to get the ball rolling, begin to plant the seeds of these 3 conditions for hope to thrive. First of all, don't be afraid to hope. You know, when I was a kid, I had adults give me the advice, don't get your hopes up. Don't get your hopes up. I don't know if anybody else was given that advice. You know, what does that mean? It means, I think, don't allow yourself to hope too much because you'll be disappointed. And I realized that the adults who gave me that advice were well-meaning. They cared about me. They were trying to protect me from being disappointed. But now that I'm an adult, I think that's not very good advice. And it's not very good advice because the truth is that regardless of whether we allow ourselves to hope or not, disappointment is going to happen in our lives. It's going to happen in all of our lives. Unfortunately, it might happen for some of us more than others, but it's going to happen to all of us at some point. Sometimes very big disappointment. But I don't think the solution to that is never allowing ourselves to feel hopeful. I don't think the solution to that is giving up on hope or surrendering all of our hope. Because if you think about it, isn't hope the psychological engine that drives progress in our lives? Isn't hope, goals, pathways, and agency, that psychological asset that allows us to set goals, that allows us to move towards the things that we care about, that allows us to solve the problems and deal with the obstacles in our life? So I worry about if people take the advice not to get your hopes up too seriously. I worry about if people give up hope, that they're actually giving up the exact psychological asset that perhaps could really make a difference in their lives. So, I really urge you that if you feel hopeless, if you're facing real problems in your life, even if they're as bad as Alan Locke's problems, that person that I told you the story earlier, or even worse, know that it's still possible to hope. It's still possible to hope. And I'm not talking about optimism. I'm not talking about glass half full, rose-colored glasses thinking. I'm talking about realistic, grounded hope, right? Goals, pathways, and agency. But of course, who could blame any of us for feeling hopeless? Like I said, we've all lived through this terrible virus. We've all seen the ongoing realities of race-based hate and violence. We've all seen the war in Ukraine. Many of us are scared about the natural disasters that are occurring around us and the political discord that we're seeing in our country and around the globe. It's easy to feel hopeless. And like I said, I've had more and more people come up to me and say that they feel hopeless, that society, that our world will ever improve, that they've given up. And that really worries me too, because not only is hope the psychological engine that drives progress in our own lives, I think it's also the psychological engine that drives progress in our society. I mean, don't we need goals, pathways, and agency in order to come together as a society and a world and solve the problems that we're facing? So I worry about what happens when people all over the world give up on hope. Aren't we giving up on the very thing that we need? And aren't we creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where we're not going to be able to solve the problems we're facing? So I think it's so crucial that we not buy into that advice that my parents and teachers gave me, that we should give up hope, and instead that we always maintain our hope, especially in the face of hard times. Related to that, I think it's important to be a model of hope. Our kids are watching us. It's not just us that have lived through the last 3 or 4 years. Our kids have too. And you bet they're watching us for how we cope. And so I think it's so important for us to be a model of hope, for us to model goals, pathways, and agency, especially when we're facing hard times. If we model that for kids, that's what they'll learn. If we model hopelessness for kids, unfortunately, that's what they'll learn as well. And building on that, I think it's important that we be honest with ourselves and with our kids. Hope is grounded in reality. Hope is grounded in reality. Remember, hope is not the same as positive thinking. It's not the same as optimism, right? Hope is grounded in acknowledging the realistic problems we face. So when we have our kids come to us and they say things like, look around you. The world is filled with racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia. It's filled with war and tragedy. It's filled with natural disasters and pain. Our natural tendency as caring, well-meaning adults is to protect them. It's to build a cocoon around them and to say, don't worry, it'll be okay. Everything will work out, right? Look on the bright side. But the truth is, our kids are smarter than that. They're smarter than that. They know that's not totally true. And when we say things like that, I think it often just sounds empty to them. And so I think it's so important that we say to our kids, but also that we admit to ourselves that yes, there's a lot of pain and suffering in the world. And there might also be pain and suffering in our own lives. But that's not a reason to give up hope. Because remember, that's actually where hope starts, right? Hope starts by grounding ourselves in the reality of what we're facing, grieving that reality, but then asking that question, what now? What can I do now to begin to set new goals, find new pathways, find new sources of agency? And that's possible even in the face of problems in our lives. And finally, be aware of where your hope falters, goals, pathways, or agency. So I'm going to spend just a little time on this one. One of the things that I love about this theory of hope, or this view of hope, is that it's very practical. It gives us something to do when we feel hopeless. So when I'm hopeless, I like to ask myself, where is my hope faltering? Is it goals? Is it pathways? Or is it agency? If it's goals, what that means is I probably don't have a goal in my life that's truly intrinsically meaningful to me. So I have to really sit down and think about what might one of those look like, even if it's small. I always think of my good friend who in May of 2020 called me up and said that she was feeling hopeless. She was isolated at home and lonely and scared, like many of us in the midst of COVID. She had been furloughed from her job and was afraid for her financial situation. And she told me she was hopeless. And I listened to her very carefully. And then I said, hey, let me suggest something. I know this is going to sound small, but humor me. Is there one thing you can do, even a small thing, that would use your talents and abilities, that would allow you to set a goal that would empower you a little bit, make you feel a little more hopeful? Well, my friend was very good at sewing fabric. So she decided that she would take scraps of fabric and make them into face masks. And this was at a time in early 2020 when there was a shortage of masks. And so she started making these for people and giving them to her friends, and then giving them to nonprofits for people who didn't have access to masks or couldn't afford masks. She made about 200 of them. And I caught up with her about a month later, and she was a transformed person. She felt so much more hopeful because she had planted the seed of this first condition for hope to thrive. Now, don't get me wrong, this didn't solve all of her problems, but it did get the ball rolling. It did begin to plant that first seed. What about if you're low on pathways? Well, if you're low on pathways, it means you can't think of a way to get to your goals. And often what that means is some way, some plan that you had is blocked. It's blocked. There's an obstacle in your path. And I don't have a magical solution for this, but what often works for me is to sit down with a pencil and paper and spend some time brainstorming. Really just write out, what are some things, even small things, that I might be able to do to begin to get around whatever is blocking my path? I know that sounds kind of unromantic, but that can sometimes open your mind to new possibilities. And we can do that for our kids, our youth too, because there's a way in which young people tend to give up hope pretty quickly, tend to give up on a goal pretty fast. And so we can say to them when they're facing that, hey, hold on for a second. Let's sit down together. Let's put our heads together and let's figure out if there are any ways that you can get around this obstacle and maybe get to the goals that are important to you. Well, finally, if you're low on agency, what that means is you're just low on motivation and energy. And like I said, there are many sources for that. But for me, what often helps is to go to those people that care about me. I mentioned them earlier, those cheerleaders in my life. For me, that's always been my father. Those people who believe in me more than I do, who can lend me a little bit of their agency until I get my own. And we can be that for the young people in our lives. I know if you were raising teenagers, they probably say to you all the time that they don't care what you think. They don't care. And maybe that's true, but I doubt it. I bet they do secretly care. And by being a cheerleader for them and lending them a little bit of your agency, even if it annoys them, you're actually doing a great service. Goals, pathways, and agency. So that's what I'm going to say about nurturing hope in ourselves and also in our kids. And I just want to leave you with a quote from the great essayist and activist Rebecca Solnit. I think she was writing about politics in this quote, but actually I think it applies to anything in our lives. Your opponents, whoever or whatever they are, your opponents would love you to believe that it's hopeless, that you have no power, that there's no reason to act, that you can't win. But hope is a gift you don't have to surrender, a power you don't have to throw away. Thank you.
Well,
I think, Charlene, you're going to facilitate a little bit of Q&A.
a little bit of Q&A. You know, Dave and Mark, I was incredibly struck in listening to you that the three conditions of hope that you mentioned, goals, pathways, and agency, is exactly what Kaminar does. And Mark, I just want your reaction to that.
Well, right. It's, David described a great kind of behavioral schema that's based in cognitive behavioral therapy, that actually we use this technique with our clients who are facing depression. And Dave, I just want to thank you again for describing it in such great detail and making it so accessible to everyone.
Pleasure.
Well, you know, the questions really have to do with things that you talked about. How do you model hope for a child who may not feel it, who may be very self-critical? What would you say to that parent or that child?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of our youth are very self-critical, and I wish I had a magical answer for you. I think that modeling hope is a slow process. Like I said, this view of hope seems simple, and it is simple, but it's not easy, and it takes time. So I think it's about really hanging in there as a parent or a teacher and continuously showing them through our own actions in our own life, that when we're faced with problems, right, we don't give up. We believe even when we get depressed, that there still might be reason to set new goals, to even when we don't feel like it, to find new pathways, to find sources of motivation, to reach out to those people that can support us. And that when our kids watch us do that in our own lives, that's a lesson for them. But I also think it's about inviting them. We can't make them do anything, but inviting them to do that in their own life. Saying, I want to be that person for you. How can I help you? And talking about these concepts, every once in a while, dropping a little hint, but we can't force it. We can't force it. And to some degree, we need to slow down and be okay with that. And I know that's really, really hard as a parent because we're afraid for our kids. But the more we force it, the less it'll work. So I think it's about inviting, it's about slowly modeling, it's about showing it at work in our own lives, and it's about cheerleading our kids the best we can.
You know, I think about William Damon, who always would say, kids may not need to have a passion, but they can have a purpose, even if it's a small one, right? And I think that we see that. And again, it makes me think of Kaminar, Mark, that you give people who don't have purpose, don't know what they're going to do next, things to look forward to have hope, right?
Exactly. And I think the other pieces that Dave called out that was inspiring is lending people your agency as a way of modeling it and giving them the energy to keep going forward.
Yeah. And also, I guess one other thing I want to say is start small. Sometimes I think, I work with college students mostly, but I hear from my 18, 19-year-old college students, so sort of at the end of adolescence, that they want a life's passion. They want a huge life's purpose. And what I often say to them is one step at a time. Let's just start with what you're going to do this week that sounds interesting to you or fun to you or meaningful to you. So I think sometimes we can actually, with our youth, kind of bring them down to earth and say, let's start small, much like my friend who made the masks at the beginning of 2020, because that can begin to set these conditions for hope to thrive in small ways and can kind of start a snowball effect, right? Once you start it and the hope process gets going, it becomes easier and easier.
So there's a final question that we always ask at the end of our events, and I cannot resist asking it tonight. So I'm going to ask it of both of you. Based on everything that you've seen and studied and the work that you do, what gives you hope? I'm going to let, either of you choose to start.
Mark, go ahead.
Well, I just have to say it's a moment in the season of my community that this is a time of renewal and turning. And I think part of what gives me hope is that we are surrounded by traditions, religions, philosophy that help us find a path forward, that we're not the first people in the broad span of humanity who face really existential issues that has affected our children deeply. So it's important to remember that, and that our not only psychology, but our religions and our cultures have very resilient tools that are embedded in them.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I'm just saying, beautifully said, Mark. I dare you to top that, Dave.
I can't. But for me, I have to say it's the clients that I've worked with over the years. It's the people that I've worked with who have been facing trauma and tragedy and serious loss, life-threatening illness, even terminal illness, not to mention have faced racism and sexism and homophobia, situations of poverty, low socioeconomic status, lots of pain and suffering, who nonetheless have been teachers to me about hope, have taught me that they keep going, that they keep finding that next goal, that next pathway, that next piece of agency, that they believe in themselves and their agency in the world. And whenever I meet people like that, and I meet so many, they inspire me and show me that hope is possible no matter what.
Wow. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Mark Cloutier and Kaminar, for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation tonight. And to you, Dr. Dave Feldman, thank you so much for your brilliant discussion. I hope everybody, we love all the emojis and we appreciate all the kind words and thoughts. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. Good night, everybody.